Now, joining us on the phone line to discuss this judgment further and also to provide some reaction is criminal attorney, BDK attorney Ulrich Roo, joining us on the phone line. Good afternoon to you and thank you for joining us here on ANN7. Just talk us through this judgment and also your reaction.
Hi, good afternoon. Yes, I think certainly a very important judgment. We must look at who brought the application. That was Corruption Watch and the Freedom and the Movement Association. And, it goes to the core of it that the so-called golden handshake that the previous head of the NPA had received was unlawful. He should never have received it. And that Shaun Abrahams should never have been appointed. Now, this goes, a long way towards the fact that people are going to, and even though the judgment says that all decisions made by Abrahams are deemed as being lawful when he was head of the NPA, people are going to ask serious questions as to was he ever, the right person for the job. His appointment is deemed completely unlawful. And I think a very, very important decision in the current political climate, with corruption being rife in our country as it is, with the involvement of our leaders and our ministers in corruption and this being exploited. I think that it is a very important ruling. Also, the fact that the president himself at the moment cannot be involved in any way whatsoever in the appointment of the new NPA. Because of the pending criminal charges hanging over his head currently. I think that is very important. How previously the head of the NPA was appointed at the sole discretion of the president, and now that discretion has been taken away by the courts. So a very important decision.
Mr. Roo, let's expand on one of the points that you've already brought to the fore, and this is that Shaun Abrahams will now need to vacate his position as well. Just talk us through the knock-on effect here and the impact and how the court has come to that judgment.
Well, Shaun Abrahams' tenure has been loaded with controversy and with decisions that have come under great scrutiny. I think obviously the most important one having been when he announced to the world that our Minister of Finance at the time, Robin Gordhan, would be charged with fraud, and then bizarrely withdrawing the charges a few months later, saying that the investigation had not been done, and effectively saying that his office had made a complete mess of that function. And, it certainly has a great knock-on effect. How do you say to people like Robin Gordhan now and everyone else who's been charged with certain charges and having been accused of crimes, that the person who ultimately made the decision should never have been in that position? So a massive knock-on effect, in my opinion. One would have to wait and see whether any such individuals approach a court. But, devastating to the NPA, I think. We need proper leaders in the NPA. It is the prosecuting authority of our country. It is the people who are there to ensure that our laws are adhered to and are administered. And unless we can rid it of incompetent leadership and corruption, we're going to face a lot of problems coming up.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Roo, for sharing your comments with us this afternoon. We appreciate you talking to us. That was criminal attorney from BDK attorney Ulrich Roo joining us on the phone line, just talking to us about this judgment that was handed down not too long ago. The North Gauteng High Court judge has ordered that current head of the NDPP, Shaun Abrahams, should vacate his position immediately and former head to pay back his golden handshake. That's 17 million rand. We continue to unpack the story here on ANN7. For further legal comment now, we are joined by legal expert Paul Ngobeni, joins us on the phone line as well. Good afternoon to you. Thank you for joining us here on ANN7.
Good afternoon.
Your initial reaction to the judgment handed down in the North Gauteng High Court not too long ago?
Well, what struck me in this judgment was the part relating to Mr. Shaun Abrahams. That part, I think, should Mr. Abrahams or should the President appeal the judgment, it's likely to be set aside. Because there is something illogical in what the court is saying. The court is saying that because Mr. Nxasana's departure was deemed unlawful, then it means that his position at the time Abrahams was appointed was not properly vacant. Well, that is absurd. I'm sorry to say that about a court judgment, but it's just so illogical. whether or not the departure was lawful or unlawful, at the time Mr. Abrams was appointed, the position was vacant. And Mr. Abrams, for the time that he has served as the NDPP, the decisions that he takes cannot be retroactively set aside. So the notion that his position was not properly vacant, it's clutching at straws by the court. It's actually so illogical that it cannot stand on appeal. The position was vacant because the incumbent of the position had accepted a golden handshake of about 17 million rand. It doesn't matter that now in hindsight he regrets it, but the fact remains he saw money, he grabbed it, and then signed an agreement that he was going to retire. And remember that at the time when Mr. Nxasana was entering into this agreement with regard to the golden handshake, he was facing disciplinary charges. Some of those charges, this issue about this security clearance, I had written an article actually criticizing the decision to go after him for that because I didn't think that was a fair or a proper charge to bring against him. But I also warned in that same article that Mr. Nxasana was accusing all his subordinates in his office of a conspiracy against him. Now, if you are the head of an important institution like the NDPP, and then you accuse those who are your subordinates of all conspiring against you, that means you can no longer be an effective leader. That in itself will have been ground to have him removed from his position. So the court's focus on the issue of whether there was a 17 million rand golden handshake missed the bigger part of whether there was bargaining between Mr. Nxasana, who was facing disciplinary charges, some of which were likely to stick, and whether he was offered an incentive, whether he saw the 17 million rand as a way out, rather than being disgracefully forced out of office, he accepted the 17 million rand. So this notion that Mr. Abrams was not properly appointed because Mr. Nxasana's departure was unlawful. I mean, think of it this way. If you are hired in a position in any company and the person who was before you was unlawfully fired, maybe they were fired because they are too short or because they are black or because they are Indian or whatever, something that is unlawful, you as the incoming person, the innocent, newly hired person, cannot be said to lose your position on the hyper technical definition that the position was not vacant because the person who was before you was not lawfully terminated. Doesn't work that way. The position was vacant because the incumbent in that position was gone. He had accepted a golden handshake.
I hear you,
which remained valid.
Is it not then the issue that the issue around Shaun Abrams? Is it not that he was appointed by President Jacob Zuma, and the court has now said that President Jacob Zuma is conflicted in the appointment of a new head of the NPA because of his current legal challenges?
Absolutely not, ma'am. You see, the problem right there is that the court is conflating two issues. At the time Mr. Abrams was appointed, there was no court judgment anywhere that set aside the withdrawal of the charges against Jacob Zuma in 2009, the withdrawal of the charges by Mshe. So there was no conflict that Mr. Zuma had at the time of Mr. Abrams' appointment. So it's illogical to say, because the charges or the matter has now been referred back to the NDPP, that it retroactively renders Zuma conflicted at the time he appointed Abrams. It's so illogical. A judge cannot make those kinds of just gross errors in judgment.
And what do you make of the court now stating that President Jacob Zuma cannot choose or elect the new head of the NPA, and that Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa is now left with that job? You see,
here's the problem. The court is again trying to do the job of the executive. It's ignoring the separation of powers principle. And it's also showing ignorance on how NDPPs are appointed. It's not just a unilateral act by the president waking up one morning and announcing that he's appointing the NDPP. there is consultation with Parliament. There is input that President will receive. And the President, that power to appoint the head of the state security, the head of SARS, and the head of, it's not SARS, SAPS, South African Police Service, and the head of the NPA. It's a constitutional responsibility assigned to the President under the Constitution. So this notion that the President cannot appoint an NDPP simply because he himself is facing some criminal charges, that again means a judge who's trying to make political judgment call as opposed to deciding cases on the merits. Cannot be.
All right, thank you very much.
There is no conflict. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that the constitutional duty to appoint all these heads of the various security-related agencies is exclusively that of the President. The President cannot be deemed to be conflicted simply because there is a possibility. Remember that the matter has been referred to the NPA to make a decision as to whether or not to reinstate the charges against the President. So to rule that without knowing how long the NPA is going to take, what if tomorrow the NPA says there is no case against the President and we have dropped the charges? The conflict isn't there. But the judge has already made this far-reaching ruling that seems to suggest that the President is inherently conflicted. That cannot be. This is where judges invite political attacks against themselves when they make judgments that are actually political judgments couched in legal terms.
We hear you, Mr. Ngobeni. We hear you. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon and sharing your comments and your views with us. We appreciate you talking to us.